Senator King.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the folks in Rome might be onto something if they put us all in the same room with 500-year-old plumbing and say nobody leaves until you have a deal. We could solve this thing. I think Senator Johnson really hit it, and the discussion is really about the role and size of government. And I had an experience in Maine when I was governor. And by the way, Senator McConnell told me once that if you ask a governor who's now a senator if he enjoys being a senator more, and he says
especially
yes.
As we have a brand new chair and ranking member. The bill increases support for firefighters battling blazes out west. That's very good. Maintains a critical safety net for women and children. Very good. Returns full funding to several critical conservation programs and reaffirms our commitment to veterans, especially rural veterans. All very good. And I want to thank Senator Jack Reed and Senator Tim Johnson in particular for those efforts in those areas. But while no bill is perfect, Mr. President, I am deeply, deeply disappointed by two provisions that were slipped into this bill by the House of Representatives when this deal was being cooked up in December. This is Sunshine Week for the federal government. It's time to highlight the need for greater transparency and openness so voters can hold their elected leaders accountable and for what happens here in Washington, D.C., and to just know what's going on. I take transparency seriously. When I first ran for the Senate 7 years ago, I campaigned on the need to bring more accountability and honest leadership to Washington, D.C. My first vote in this body was for a sweeping ethics bill that, among other provisions, improve disclosure rules and reform the earmark process so that everybody would know which member or members of Congress requested an earmark. And it required members to certify that they and their families had no financial interest in that earmark. Under regular order, folks had a chance to come down to the floor and try to remove earmarks that they didn't like. In fact, a few years ago, I remember former Senator John Kyle and I had a pretty good debate on this floor about an important project for the city of Whitefish, Montana. So we debated it, and we took a vote on it in the Senate. And that is why I am so upset by two agricultural-related provisions that someone from the House of Representatives put into this bill and that the Senate seems willing to accept. I don't know who authored this provision. Maybe someone in Washington knows, but no one is willing to put their name on it, and that's a shame. It's a shame that folks who get so bent out of shape about earmarks do not seem to be troubled by these provisions. Mr. President, Montana is home to thousands of working families that make a living off the land. Like my wife and I, they're family farmers and ranchers. The House of Representatives is prepared to toss those working families aside in favor of the nation's large meatpacking corporations. The House inserted a provision in the bill that gives enormous marketing power to America's three largest meatpacking corporations while stiffing family farmers and ranchers. Family-run production agriculture faces tremendous market manipulation. Chicken farmers, hog farmers, cattle ranchers all struggle to get a fair price from the meat packers. And if they fight back, they risk angering corporate representatives and being shut out of the market. Thanks to this provision, the Agricultural Department will not be able to ensure a fair, open market that put the brakes on the worst abuses by the meatpacking industry. What's worse is that the USDA took congressionally mandated steps to protect ranchers from market manipulation over the last few years. That's what we told them to do in the 2008 Farm Bill. And this provision will actually overturn rules that the USDA has already put into place. But apparently intense behind-the-scenes lobbying won out in the House of Representatives, and now we're back to square one with the big meat packers calling the shots. The second provision sent over from the House tells the USDA to ignore any judicial ruling regarding the planting of genetically modified crops. Its supporters are calling it farmer assurance provision. But all it really assures is a lack of corporate liability. The provision says that when a judge finds that the USDA approved a crop illegally, the department must reapprove the crop and allow it to continue to be planted, regardless of what the judge says. Now let's think about that. The United States Congress is telling the Agricultural Department that even if a court tells you that you've failed to follow the right process and tells you to start over, you must disregard the court's ruling and allow the crop to be planted anyway. Not only Does this ignore the Constitution idea of separation of powers, but it also lets genetically modified crops take hold across this country, even when a judge finds it violates the law? Once again, agribusiness, multinational corporations putting farmers as serfs. It's a dangerous precedent. Mr. President, it will paralyze the USDA, putting the department in the middle of a battle between Congress and the courts. And the ultimate loser will be our family farmers going about their business and feeding America in the right way. Sunshine Week shouldn't be show and tell, Mr. President, and slipping corporate giveaways into a bill at the same time that we call for more open government is doubling down on the same policies that created the need for Sunshine Week in the first place. That's why I've introduced two amendments to remove these corporate welfare provisions from the bill. Montanans elected me to go to the Senate to do away with the shady backroom deals, to get rid of handouts to big corporations, and to make government work better. We still have many challenges in front of us, and I commend the leaders of the Appropriation Committee for their commitment to working together to bring us on a plan we can vote. But these two provisions undermine our good work to support family farm agriculture. These provisions are giveaways, pure and simple, and will be a boon worth millions of dollars to a handful of the biggest corporations in this country. They deserve no place in this bill. We simply have got to do a better job on both policy and process. Now, I know that Chairwoman Mikulski is committed to doing better, and I strongly support her efforts. And I want to thank her for that commitment. But we ought to start right here and now by striking these corporate giveaways. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Further proceedings on the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, so ordered. The senator from Arizona is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to set aside the pending amendment and call up amendment number 33.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Could the senator withhold to the senator from Arizona?
Senator from Maryland is recognized.
I yield to the chairwoman.
First of all, I know you've been waiting patiently to offer this amendment, and I've been waiting patiently for you to be able to do it. As I understand it, we're trying to negotiate a sequence here to vote on the Harkin amendment and for you to be able to offer your amendment as promptly and as swiftly as we can. And I say to the distinguished Vice Chairman of the committee, could we, Mr. Chairman, I note the absence of a quorum without violating the gentleman's rights.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
I ask that further proceedings on the quorum call be suspended and ask unanimous
Without objection.
to set aside the pending amendment and call up amendment number 33.
Without objection, so ordered. The senior senator from Arizona is recognized. Clerk will report.
The senator from Arizona, Mr. McCain, proposes an amendment number 33.
Further reading of the amendment be dispensed.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to talk about Amendment number 33, which would strike sections 104 and 8039 of the bill. It's a pair of Guam earmarks that directly contravene the explicit direction provided by the Armed Services Committee of the Senate and the House of Representatives in the conference report on the fiscal year 2013 National Defense Authorization Act. Congress has not yet received a sufficient cost analysis of the proposed movement of the troops from Okinawa to Guam, and because of that, and the whole operation of these troops from Okinawa to Guam has still not been decided, the Armed Services Committees of the House and Senate explicitly prohibited this type of premature investments in civilian infrastructure. At a time when the Department of Defense is facing the impact of sequestration, on top of the $487 million in cuts directed by the President, it's appalling and disgraceful that the authorizing language would be directly circumvented by the authorizers. Now, I want to read, to my colleagues' benefit, the language that after hours and hours of hearings, of amendments, of markup, of 3 weeks on the floor of the Senate, the product stated, quote, restriction on development of public infrastructure. If the Secretary of Defense determines that any grant, cooperative agreement, transfer of funds, and other federal agency or supplemental funds available in fiscal year 2012 or 2013 under federal programs administered by agencies other than the Department of Defense will result in the development, including repair, replacement, renovation, conversion, improvement, expansion, acquisition, or construction of public infrastructure on Guam, the Secretary of Defense may not carry out such grant, transfer, cooperative agreement, or supplemental funding unless such grant, transfer, cooperative agreement, or supplemental funding is specifically authorized by law. So, here is a clear language of the National Defense Authorization Act directly contradicted by this continuing resolution. What in the world is the job of the authorizers if it is not to have the language adhered to? This is at a time when the Department of Defense is facing the impact of sequestration on top of $487 million in cuts already directed by the President, the appropriators decided that we would spend $140 million on Guam. It's absolutely unbelievable, I say to my colleagues. Now, let me tell my colleagues about the effect of sequester that's happened now. Now, according to this line item in the appropriations bill, they will spend $140 million on a wastewater treatment plant in Guam and another project. So we're going to spend $140 million on that. Meanwhile, I say to my colleagues, here's what's already happened with sequester on the armed forces. The Army cancels 4 brigade exercises at the National Training Center or Joint Readiness Training Center. The Army reduced base operations by 30%, cancels half a year of helicopters and ground vehicle depot maintenance, stops post-war repair of 1,300 vehicles and 17,000 weapons, reduces readiness of 80% of the Army's non-deploying brigades, stops tuition assistance for all active and reserve soldiers, Navy, cancels several submarine deployments, reduces flying hours on deployed carriers in the Middle East by 55%, steaming days by 22%, reduces Western Pacific deployed operations by 35%. Non-deployed Pacific ships lose 40% of steaming days, reduces Middle East Atlantic Med ballistic missile defense patrols, shuts down all flying for 4 of 9 carrier air wings, 9 to 12 months to restore normal readiness at 2 to 3 times the cost, cuts all major naval exercises, defers emergent repairs, cancels Blue Angel shows in third and fourth quarter, USS Truman carrier deployment delayed indefinitely. I might say that deployment was to the Middle East where the centrifuges are spinning. The USS Eisenhower carrier deployment extended indefinitely. USS Nimitz and USS Bush carrier strike groups will not be fully ready for scheduled fiscal year 13 deployments. Air Force likely prevent Air Force's ability to achieve the 2017 goal of being fully auditable. Defer non-emergency facility requirements. Reduce repairs by 50%. Over 420 projects at over 140 installations across the Air Force. Affects runway repairs and critical sustainment projects. Delays planned acquisition of satellites and aircraft, including JSF and AC-130J, which will increase the future cost of these systems. Reduces flying hours for cargo, fighter, and bomber aircraft. Stops tuition assistance for all active and reserve airmen. Marine Corps. And I hope my colleagues will listen to this. Commandant of the Marine Corps says, by the end of this year, more than 50% of my combat units will be below minimal acceptable levels of readiness for deployment to combat. I repeat, the Commandant of the Marine Corps says by the end of this year, more than 50% of my combat units will be below minimal acceptable levels of readiness for deployment to combat. Unable to complete rebalancing of Marine Corps forces in the Asia-Pacific region will cause 55% of the United States Marine Corps forces to have unsatisfactory readiness ratings. 50% of the United States Marine Corps aviation squadrons will fall below ready to deploy status. The United States Marine Corps will not be able to accomplish planned reset of equipment returning from overseas expeditionary forces. Depot-level maintenance will be reduced, delaying resetability by 18 months and reducing readiness of non-deployed forces. Facility sustainment will be funded at 71% of requirement, reducing effectiveness of home station training and quality of life. Now, these are the effects of sequestration. And so what do they do? What do they do in the continuing resolution? They add $140 million for Guam, for a wastewater treatment plant. Talk about divorce from reality. Talk about insensitivity to the men and women who are serving this country. And I'm already beginning to hear from them. I'll tell you that, Mr. President. You know, there's a lot of bright young men and women who are serving this country and are serving it with courage and skill and with the best probably we've ever seen. And I'm hearing from their leaders. They're making decisions about whether to stay in the military or not. It's an all-volunteer force. And I can tell you what a lot of them are deciding. And when they see something as ridiculous as this, and there's other outrageous and stupid things in this bill, while all of the things that are taking place, the Air Force and the Army and the Marine Corps, we are now on this list, we have $5 million. They're adding money, adding millions. In fact, it comes up to billions. $5 million for the National Guard Youth Challenge Program, $5 million for the Department of Defense Star-Based Youth Program, $154 million for Army, Navy, and Air Force, quote, alternative energy resource initiatives, $18 million for unspecified, quote, industrial preparedness, $16 million for Parkinson's disease research, and there's a whole bunch in here for medical research, and they're taking it out of defense. I'm for research in all these programs, whether it be Parkinson's or neurofibromatosis or HIV/AIDS research, but they're taking it out of defense. $9 million for unspecified radar research, $20 million for university research initiatives, $7 million for Civil Air Patrol program increase, $45 million for impact aid. The list goes on and on and on. The Civil Air Patrol gets a 15, while the Air Force is unable to fly, the Civil Air Patrol will get an additional $15 million. Now, I'm a great admirer of the Civil Air Patrol, but the fact is that what we're doing is we're cutting the flying hours and affecting the readiness of the men and women who are serving in this country, serving in the military in this country. I repeat, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. By the end of this year, more than 50% of my combat units will be below minimal acceptable levels of readiness for deployment to combat. And what does these appropriators do? They put in $140 million for a wastewater treatment plant on Guam, which is expressly prohibited by the National Defense Authorization Act. You know, I've been on this floor for many years fighting against what I believe is encroachment by appropriators on the authoriser's business. I have never, in 26 years as a member of the Defense Authorization Committee, of the Armed Forces Committee, seen anything quite as egregious as this. And I say to my colleagues who are authorizers and not appropriators, if you let them get away with this, directly violating and contradicting the express language of the National Defense Authorization Act, then you're next. This is unacceptable. I hope that my colleagues will vote not only on the issue of whether we need to spend this money, particularly at this moment when the condition of our military. And by the way, a lot of my constituents say, why is this being so hard hit? Why is the military being so hard hit? And you know what? They don't quite understand that sequester, this thing that the President said won't happen, this sequester affects 19% of what we call the discretionary spending. They exempted about two-thirds of all of the discretionary spending and then took 50% of what was left of 19% of the spending. So you have a dramatically increased effect on what we need most, and that's our national security. And it's shameful. It's shameful. So I hope that my colleagues and friends will know that this is the Guam provision would provide, which is expressly prohibited, would provide $120 million for a public regional health laboratory and a civilian wastewater improvements. The Department of Defense wants to move Marines to Guam, but does not know how much military infrastructure will be needed. Military infrastructure will be needed to support the move, what the implications will be to operational responsiveness in the Pacific Theater, or how much any of it will cost. Over the last 2 years, the Armed Services Committee received many hours of testimony, briefings, and meetings on the troop realignment in the Pacific and directed the Center for Strategic and International Studies to conduct an independent assessment on U.S. force strategy in the region. That assessment, delivered in August 2012, recommended a better alignment of engagement strategies between the U.S. Pacific Command and the Department of Defense in order to improve our capabilities in the region and respond to a range of contingencies. The CSIS was clear in the appraisal that the Department of Defense had not, quote, adequately articulated the strategy behind its future posture planning, nor aligned the strategy with resources in a way that reflects current budget realities. After more testimony, briefings, and meetings, the Armed Services Committee acted, and through the vehicle of the fiscal year 2013 National Defense Authorization Act, prohibited the use of funds for any military realignment to Guam until the Department of Defense and the U.S. Pacific Command provided a detailed set of reports. These reports will address the plan for ensuring that any proposed force realignments in the Pacific region to include moving U.S. Marines from Japan to Guam and Hawaii are supported by resources that will allow our forces to meet operational requirements. Admiral Locklear, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, told me yesterday that these reports would be ready this summer. So, the Department of Defense has planning left to do, and while Congress may someday authorize some number of Marines to be realigned to Guam, it will only be after we have a clear understanding of the operational implications and costs. In this context, the Appropriations Committee would fund unrequested civilian infrastructure, not military infrastructure, mind you, civilian infrastructure, far greater in scope than would be required in the event that the most extreme estimates of troop realignment occur. There's absolutely no justification for it. That's why the Armed Services Committee expressly prohibited such funding, because we don't know how much military or civilian infrastructure we may need, if any. Has one single Marine, sailor, or airman been assigned to Guam as part of the intended buildup that would justify using DOD money to rebuild Guam's civilian wastewater facilities or build a new civilian health laboratory? The answer is obviously no. This is a pork barrel payoff to Guam to solve an already existing problem that has nothing to do with any future military realignment to Guam. This is no better than last year's set of earmarks for a cultural artifacts repository. It should be very clear by now these expenditures pushed through in direct contravention of the bipartisan, bicameral decisions of the Armed Services Committee are a shameful waste of taxpayers' money and, in my view, a clear example of political abuse of the appropriations process. So I could go on for a long time. In fact, we should be, as we speak, instead of doing a continuing resolution, we should be doing everything we can to avoid the sequester, which has such a disastrous effect on our military. I'm sure that my colleagues are aware that in Tehran, the centrifuges are spinning. North Korea has just had another nuclear test. They threatened to cancel the ceasefire of 1953. They're making very aggressive noises towards South Korea and our, I believe, 30,000 men and women who are stationed there. Tension between Japan and China is very high. And by the way, for my colleagues' information, I'm sure they know that the Chinese have increased and doubled and redoubled their spending on the military. And in the Middle East is in a state of turmoil that could lead to an international crisis almost at any moment. 70,000 Syrians have been slaughtered by Bashar Assad, over 1 million refugees. As that conflict shows all possibilities of spreading to Lebanon and to Jordan. So what are we doing? What are we doing? We're imposing draconian cuts on the United States military that causes the Commandant of the Marine Corps to say that 50% of all his combat units will be below minimal acceptable levels of readiness for deployment to combat. I've been around this body and this nation for a long time, and I've seen this movie before. Everybody talks about war weariness. Everybody talks about how weary we are of Iraq and Afghanistan, and indeed we are. We were war weary after Vietnam. And we cut the military, and we cut the military, and we cut the military, as we are doing today. And the Chief of Staff of the United States Army in the late 1970s came before the Armed Services Committee and said, we have a hollow army. You know what we're doing right now? You know what we are doing right now with sequestration? We are hollowing out our military. And to add insult to injury, we are putting on a long list of wasteful, unnecessary programs, many of which have nothing to do with defending this nation, and some of which are outright just pork barrel spending. So I hope that my colleagues, particularly those on authorizing committees, will understand that if the appropriators are able to directly contradict the language in authorization which is passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the President of the United States, then you become irrelevant to the process. And I don't think the 80 so of us, I believe it's around 80, that are not members of the Appropriations Committee should be subjected to irrelevance. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senior Senator from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. President, I just want to say that the senator who currently now chairs the subcommittee on defense will come to speak on the senator from Arizona's amendment. I just want to speak about the process and about sequester. First of all, the subcommittee on defense appropriations finished its work finished its work before the August research. Excuse me. The Senate Defense Appropriations finished its work in August. The authorizers didn't get it done till December 20th. So there's a gap here because Senator Inouye, working of very happy and beloved, blessed memory, moved his committee in an expeditious way, which appropriators are supposed to do. Remember, appropriations are supposed to be done before October 1st. Senator Inouye both chaired the committee, chaired the full committee, and then chaired this subcommittee on defense appropriations. Senator Inouye did his job under the authorization that was present before him. The authorizers didn't pass their bill till December 20th. So we want to respect the authorizers, not only on defense, but on every committee, but they have to pass their bills before we pass ours. We work on our bills by holding our hearings under regular order, starting when we get the President's budget. I must admit the President's late with his. We wish he would up tempo on that a bit. And then we start our hearings. We mark up our bills in May and June and begin to move them through the process. So before we attack the Appropriations Committee, we should attack the process and get back to regular order where authorizing and appropriating are in sync. The second thing I want to comment on is sequester. I want to acknowledge what the senator from Arizona said about the impact of sequester. Sequester is an awful, awful, awful thing. That is not on this bill. When the Budget Committee comes up and the negotiations by the President with the leadership of the House, I absolutely agree with him that we have to cancel sequester and make sure that not only our Defense Department, but others who defend America, like Border Patrol guards, are also not unduly harmed. The hollowing out, his quotes from General Amos, an extraordinary commandant. So what we need to do is get our process in order so we can have the proper policy debates. So, Mr. President, I'm going to yield the floor. I note that the subcommittee chairman now, Senator Durbin, who's taken this over, will comment on the specifics.
President. The Assistant Majority Leader is recognized.
Let me thank the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Mikulski of Maryland. This is her first major assignment on the floor of the United States Senate, and it's an awesome responsibility, and those of us who have been privileged to serve with her know that she's not only up to this job, she was made for this job. She has the skill and knowledge and the drive that we need to make sure the Appropriations Committee is playing its important historic role in the Senate. And I want to commend the senator from Alabama, my friend, Senator Richard Shelby. The two, Senator Shelby and Senator Mikulski, have been close partners in developing a very complicated bill. This bill we're considering is going to fund the federal government for the remaining 7 months. And otherwise, when we run out of money, I think the date's March 24th, literally the government would close. But they are working and have worked hard for the last several weeks to get this bill ready. A version of the bill passed the House. Now it's being considered on the floor of the Senate, and senators are being allowed to offer amendments, which is their right. One of the senators who just offered an amendment was Senator John McCain of Arizona, well known to virtually everyone in America as a former candidate for president and by virtue of his service to our nation. I would say I count John McCain as a real friend. We came to the House of Representatives the same year. We've maintained that friendship here in the Senate. We're working closely together on immigration reform and many other issues, and I can't think of a finer U.S. senator on either side of the aisle. And I don't have to speak to John McCain's reputation when it comes to military service. We know the story. A Navy pilot shot down over Vietnam, captured and held captive, subjected to torture for more than 5 years. John's body still bears the scars of that terrible experience. Thank God he survived it, and he continues to serve here in the United States Senate, representing the people of Arizona and literally the nation in his capacity as a U.S. Senator. And he has been the ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee, so he knows those issues not only as a veteran, a man who served in the Vietnam War, but also as a senator who has looked closely at each of the issues that affect the Department of Defense. He doesn't hold a candle to anyone, take a step back from anyone when it comes to his commitment to our military and our nation's defense. And now it's my responsibility to come to the floor of the Senate and argue against an amendment that Senator McCain is offering on the Department of Defense bill. You think to yourself, Durbin, how did you get this assignment? Well, the fact is, as chairman of this Appropriations Subcommittee, it is my responsibility to argue the other side of the issue that Senator McCain has brought to the floor. I come to this assignment brand new, just a few weeks now, since the untimely passing of our great friend and national hero, Danny Inouye of Hawaii. And because of his passing, there were vacancies created, and I ended up in this position as chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee in the Senate. It is a job I am learning, and I confess there are many here that know it better than I do. But I'll do my best at it because I know the awesome responsibility attached to it. And I stand today urging my colleagues to vote against the amendment of John McCain. The amendment that John McCain has offered to this continuing resolution as it relates to the Department of Defense. There are basically 4 provisions in this, 3 or 4 provisions in the McCain amendment, and I would like to address each of them. One of the provisions allows the Department of Defense to give grants to organizations. That sounds like a very easy thing to explain, and it is. The 3 organizations that receive the grants from the Department of Defense are well known to most Americans. Certainly 2 are. The USO. The USO for decades has been an organization which has tried to provide help to our veterans, usually stationed overseas, to give them anything as basic as entertainment to counseling when they go through airports, to make sure that they have a place to stop by and get a cup of coffee and a donut. That's the USO. I've understated their mission, but we're all familiar with it. The other organization is one known to every American, I'm sure, the Red Cross. And the third is an organization new but important called Fisher House. Fisher House. Let me tell you about Fisher House. It was 2 years ago when I was invited to the grand opening of a Fisher House facility near the Hines VA Hospital in Chicago. Fisher House is to military and veterans hospitals what Ronald McDonald Houses are to children's hospitals. So what we are saying here in the underlying bill is the Department of Defense can provide grants to these organizations, Fisher House, Red Cross, and USO. And the McCain Amendment says, no, they can't. It strikes the authority of the Department of Defense to give them these grants. I think that's a mistake. And for that reason alone, I hope that my colleagues will vote against the McCain Amendment. The services that are being provided at through these organizations and at these facilities are nothing short of remarkable. Fisher House, right out in the city of Chicago, near Hines VA Hospital, is a beautiful home, a place where families who have a loved one who's going through surgery or rehabilitation at the Hines VA Hospital are given a chance to stay overnight. They don't have to pay for a hotel room, and they're treated like royalty, as they should be. These are military families, mothers and fathers, spouses and children who are treated like royalty at this Fisher House while they're waiting for their loved one to finish the treatment and surgery that they need to come back home. Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we provide that kind of service? And the Fisher House facilities are largely built by charitable contribution, donations from everybody. So to give to the Department of Defense the ability to transfer up to $4 million a year, $4 million, to the Fisher House, why, of course we want to do that. Across America, they do such extraordinary things. And in terms of the Red Cross grants, here's what the Red Cross does, and every member of Congress knows this. A family will call a senator and say, Senator Shelby, we live in Mobile, Alabama, and I wanted you to know that the mother of a soldier overseas has just passed away. We've got to get the word to him right away. And what you'll do, Senator Shelby, and what Senator Durbin would do is call the Red Cross. You got to help us. We've got to get in touch with this serviceman or woman overseas somewhere. So it's an opportunity for them to use their network of volunteers and communications to reach out to that soldier, that sailor, that airman, that Marine. That's what they do. They spend about $10 million in emergency communication services to keep a hotline running, connecting service members, veterans and their families with the services they offer. They're $2 million for theater support of deployed troops, emergency communication services between deployed service members and their families back home. They provide lounges, the Red Cross does, in these theaters of operation, war settings, for troops to have access to computers so they can be in touch with their families back home. One of the big surprises I ran into as I visited our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq was to find many of them Skyping away with their families while they're far, far away. And some of these facilities are being provided by the Red Cross. The list goes on and on of all of the things that the Red Cross does to support and help our troops. But the list can't tell you in specifics what Red Cross volunteers do. These men and women, you see them everywhere. Under the flag of the Red Cross, they show up when the tornado hits, when the flood hits, and they always show up when our troops need a helping hand. Do you know when those troops get off the plane in Landstuhl, Germany, after being grievously wounded or injured overseas and are about to be hospitalized and maybe facing their first surgery, one of the first smiling faces they'll see will be a Red Cross volunteer, there to say, what can I do for you? Can I get in touch with your family? Is there something you need? The stories are legendary about soldiers who land at these bases and a Red Cross volunteer walks up. There's one story of one of the soldiers, a volunteer from the Red Cross, said, what do you need? He said, I need a root beer float. And they kind of laughed, and the next thing you know, in a matter of 15 minutes, up pops the Red Cross volunteer with a root beer float. It's a small thing. For that soldier, it was an important thing. And to say that we are not going to allow the Department of Defense to provide grants to the Red Cross, the USO, or Fisher House, I think that's a mistake. These are great organizations with great volunteers that do a wonderful job day in and day out to help our troops overseas. If it were my son or daughter overseas, I'd like to know that the Red Cross is going to be there. I'd like to know the USO is going to be there. And God forbid we ever need some work at a military hospital, I'd like to know there's a Fisher House nearby, just in case a family needs it that can't otherwise afford to stay in a hotel for a number of nights. The McCain Amendment would stop the grants from the Department of Defense to these three organizations. If it wasn't such a fine man and veteran as John McCain offering this amendment, some people would say, well, why would you do that, to our military service members? I don't think we should. And then there's an issue that's been going on for some time about Guam. Guam is an important place for stationing some 16,000 Marines, 16,000 men and women who volunteered to serve in the U.S. Marine Corps and are stationed on Guam. It's a challenge. I've been there. It's a remote location, important for our national security, particularly in the Pacific Theater. But wouldn't we want to say to the men and women who are there in uniform, that they are going to have the basics taken care of? And wouldn't we want to say that one of the basics is to make sure that they have safe drinking water and wastewater treatment facilities? Here's what we found out. We found out that on the island of Guam, our 16,000 Marines are in a facility that has reached the absolute limit in terms of wastewater treatment. And the Department of Defense came to us and said, for these troops, we have got to build a new wastewater treatment facility. Well, of course we do. We don't want to shortchange them or jeopardize public health in any way. The McCain Amendment would eliminate this money, $106 million, in funding for a wastewater treatment plant on Guam. This is not some frill. This is a basic. You want to believe when your son or daughter volunteers for the Marine Corps and is stationed somewhere overseas that our government is doing everything we can to make sure they have the basics they need to stay healthy? Well, this is one of them, $106 million for a wastewater treatment plant in Guam. There's also a $13 million ask here that I think makes sense when it comes to the safety of these troops. We want to make sure there is a public health lab in Guam. God forbid these men and women in uniform or anyone who represents the United States is facing some biological terrorist. God forbid there is some substance that is being used that could endanger their lives. And God forbid that we'd have to rely on laboratory facilities in Atlanta, Georgia, if you're halfway around the world. That's where the most professional facilities are. So the Department of Defense said, let's put $13 million investment in a basic public health lab in Guam to protect the safety of Americans and our troops. Look at these things. Look at what I'm asking for. Not for museums, not for things that may be considered frivolous and unnecessary in a given context, but rather for the basics, to support our troops in the field and to provide those who are stationed on Guam some of the most fundamental and basic public health facilities. So it pains me to come to the floor and to resist an amendment from my friend Senator John McCain, but I do it in memory of Senator Dan Inouye, who helped write this bill, who himself, a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, had a distinguished service in the military, distinguished career of service in the military. And I hope that my colleagues will listen carefully to this debate. And though they feel the strong positive feelings I do towards Senator McCain, go to the merits of the issue. Defeat the McCain Amendment. Make sure that the ability of the Department of Defense to work with Fisher House, the Red Cross, and the USO is continued and authorized in law. Make sure the 16,000 Marines on Guam have the most basic things that they need to be safe and healthy and come home, act like we want them to be, as safe as possible. That's what this is all about. I urge my colleagues to vote against the McCain Amendment, and I yield the floor. And suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Well, while we wait for the name of the Pope, it was important today to have President Obama come to the House Republican Conference, and it was a pleasure to welcome him and to have a dialogue with him about the important issues, the important challenges that face this country. And the American people want us. They want Congress and the President, both political parties, to be working together to address these challenges. And that's what I hope we started today. We had a discussion about important issues like balancing the budget, and we're going to be putting forward our budget to balance within 10 years shortly. We talked about energy, the importance of energy independence for this country, as well as a plan for Social Security and Medicare and making sure that we keep our promises to our seniors and that next generation. This is not just about numbers and charts and graphs. This discussion is about American people all across this country. It's about moms and dads and children and seniors and college students, people that have been out of work for months and months, and it's about making America better for them. The Senate is working on their budget. The House is working on our budget. The President and the House Republicans are meeting. I think this is all progress in the right direction. This is how it's supposed to work. So it's my sincere hope that we continue to come together to do what is good and right for America.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the President for coming to the Capitol today to visit with all of our members. And I thought that we had a very frank and candid exchange of ideas. And frankly, I think it was productive. We know, however, that there are some very real differences between our two parties, like issues, jobs, balancing the budget, and what do we do to get our economy moving again. Republicans want a balance of the budget. The President doesn't. Republicans want to solve our long-term debt problem. The President doesn't. We want to unlock our energy resources to put more Americans back to work. The President doesn't. But having said that, today was a good start. And I hope that these kinds of discussions can continue. Even though we have very real differences, our job is to find common ground to do the work the American people sent us here to do.
Good afternoon. I, too, am glad we had the opportunity to meet the President and that he did come to speak to our conference. My takeaway was, first, there are some real differences between us and the President in terms of how we go forward in this country. But I also know that there is a lot in common. In fact, we in the House, as you know, moved twice to try and replace existing sequester. And many of the provisions in the bill that we put forward came from the President's own proposals. Those are some of the things that we have in common, and it's almost like low-hanging fruit that we ought to be able to pick those up and do them together. But, you know, again, if the President wants to let our unwillingness to raise taxes get in the way, then we're not going to be able to set differences.
Suspended.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the time until 5:30 p.m. for debate on the McCain Amendment be equally divided between Senators McCain and myself or our designees, and that at 5:30 p.m. the Senate proceed to a vote in relation to the McCain Amendment, that there be no amendments in order to the amendment prior to the vote.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I don't know if Senator McCain is nearby, but if he is, I want to give him a chance to come over and use up the few minutes remaining before the roll call vote. But for those members of the Senate who did not listen to the earlier statements by Senator McCain and myself, this amendment is very basic and very straightforward. Senator McCain would cut or eliminate the ability of the Department of Defense to give grants to three organizations: Fisher House, Red Cross, and USO. Fisher House is the Ronald McDonald House of Military and Veterans Hospitals. I've visited the one in Chicago. I've talked to my colleagues about other Fisher House facilities around America. They are remarkable and amazing places. Fisher House is where a family that may not be wealthy has a chance to stay and be treated like royalty while their son, their daughter, their husband, their mother is being operated on at a military hospital. That's what Fisher House is all about. I've seen it. Volunteers man these houses, make sure that people are treated in the way they should be, make us proud as Americans. The McCain Amendment would eliminate the authority of the Department of Defense to give money to the Fisher House to continue their operations. The McCain Amendment would also eliminate funding, grants that are given to the Red Cross and the USO. The Red Cross is an extraordinary organization, and every American knows what they're about. But in the fiscal year 2010, the Red Cross provided more than 597,000 emergency communication services for nearly 150,000 military families. And they provided nearly $6 million in financial aid to 5,000 military families. Not to mention thousands of Red Cross volunteers, including service members, veterans, and military spouses, who offered comfort and support to our wounded troops and their families in hospitals around the world. The USO, another great organization, which has provided assistance and entertainment to our troops, many of them stationed far away from home and far away from their family. And in addition, the McCain Amendment would eliminate the construction of a wastewater treatment facility in Guam. We have 16,000 Marines stationed in Guam. The administration, the President, has asked for this money because the wastewater treatment facility in Guam is inadequate. It is not safe. It's a public health hazard. An environmental impact statement prepared for the realignment of Marines from Okinawa to Guam clearly finds that the current system is near capacity and needs upgrade. So whether you argue that Guam is going to have a large future, a small future, the current allocation of Marines in Guam deserve the most basic sanitary wastewater treatment facility. You'd expect it, would you not, for your son or daughter serving in our Marine Corps? We should expect no less. And the McCain Amendment would eliminate the funding necessary for this wastewater treatment facility, as well as a public health laboratory, to test samples of suspected toxic substances in a timely manner to protect Americans and our troops in that theater of the world. I don't know why Senator McCain has picked out these elements. I think they are all positive elements. I hope that my colleagues will join me in defeating the McCain Amendment. It is an amendment which would take needed resources away from the USO, Red Cross and Fisher House, and deny this wastewater treatment facility in Guam. I hope that my colleagues will join me in opposing the McCain Amendment. I'm going to, at this point, yield the floor and suggest the evidence of a quorum in the hopes that Senator McCain can return before the vote.
Clerk will call the roll.